I've got two questions here. I think they're two
boy.
sides of the same coin, so I'm reading both.
Okay.
Lee asks, is the Department of Justice case actually now Tim Cook's legacy? Under his tenure, the actions and choices from Apple have led them to these moments of conflict with regulators. So rather than a car or the Vision Pro, is this Tim's legacy? Albert asks, given Apple's handling of the DMA and AI, do you think it's reasonable to consider it is time for Tim Cook to step down?
So they're both sides of the same coin. You want me to flip a coin? Is that what's happening now? Are you asking
Well,
me to
no,
flip
I
a
think
coin?
I think you understand what I'm saying, that both of these questions are of a similar thing of like, is Tim to blame for all of this? Is this what's going to follow him around? Da, 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 da.
Yeah. I just wanted to talk about coin flipping.
Oh, yeah. No, we don't let you flip coins. You're not allowed to flip coins.
So, all right. To be determined, I'm sorry to say it this way, but this is how it has to be, is what is the result? If the result is a nothing or an almost nothing, minor changes to Apple's business model that don't actually have major effects on Apple's future, then no. To all.
Yeah.
If Apple ends up having its business model deeply disrupted in a way that everybody views as being avoidable, which is a question, right? Like, it may be that if there's a deep disruption in Apple's business model, we'll look back and say, how would they have satisfied these people, right? How would they have changed their case? And because it's possible that all the things we've said, oh, this could have been avoided if you did all these things, it's possible that wouldn't have avoided it, that it was going to happen. They didn't make it better, right? But it's possible that this was unavoidable. So if it goes badly and Apple ends up being, broken up, or their business model is invalidated because they have to start building APIs for everything that is integrated with their own products, and that makes everything more difficult for them. And as a result, Apple as a business is kind of broken. Absolutely, it's part of Tim Cook's legacy. But the dare I say the jury's still out? There is no jury yet, but there may be at a time in the future. I think those are the questions. History is not yet to be written on this point. So it could be his legacy. I think, and is it reasonable to consider if it's time for him to step down? Well, given Apple's handling of AI, you mean the thing that they haven't announced yet? And is it reasonable to say that Apple should, or that Tim Cook should step down because Apple didn't have a large language model out there last year? No, it's not. That's stupid. It's stupid. Yeah. If history's not written, if in 5 years it turns out that AI completely changed how computing works and Apple never got there because they were sleeping too long, then yes, then it's a great question, right? I just don't know. And so for both of these, I'd say the jury is still out. Right now, what I would say is that Tim Cook's legacy is that when he took over, Apple was a fraction of the size that it is now. And judged by market valuation and profits and revenue, Tim Cook's legacy is that Apple scaled up from a company that had a lot of potential to a company that had all the money. And that if I had to guess, that will be his legacy. But the truth is, legacy when? Legacy now? Legacy in 5 years? Legacy in 20 years, right? Because it's possible from the vantage point of 20 years, we'll say, oh, Tim Cook, yeah, they made a lot of money then, but then they kind of got in trouble and lost their way. Or we might say, oh, Tim Cook, yeah, they made a lot of money and then they went out of business or were regulated out of business. Or we might say, oh, yeah, Tim Cook, he really grew Apple to a whole new level, and then they just kept going from there. But in 5 years and 20 years, the legacy is constantly being recalculated. But for right now, I'd say that people right now, the judgment would be that he took a business that was smaller, and granted, had a lot of the pieces ready to go, right? People like, oh, well, Steve Jobs got all that ready. It's like he did get it all ready, but Tim Cook's the one who took all that stuff that he inherited from Steve Jobs and presided over this enormous expansion of Apple's size and profitability and revenue generation. So sorry to not give a straight answer to this question.
No, I actually think you've given, the only right answer, which is that, like, at this point, for both of these things, and the reason I brought these things, we've had a few questions like this. It is too soon to suggest that either of these things were a mistake. Like,
right.
Currently, all of the things that have led to the DMA and the DOJ, they were a scenario of the exact right thing to do because Apple is massive, and it makes so much money. And you can make a very good argument that Tim Cook did exactly what he was supposed to do, which was make the most money possible.
Yeah, and grow the company and grow the stock price and grow the valuation and all those things. And it may be yet that the DMA or something. Again, the DMA and the U.S. regulations could break Apple. I think the most likely scenario is Apple, after protesting that a lot of the changes that are wanted are anathema to Apple's entire business model and its credo of protecting its customers. And we all say that it is actually because Apple wants to make more money, that the concessions Apple has to make to satisfy everybody are so limited that while Apple makes a little less money, they've already made that up in growth, and that no major changes to their business model are instituted, and they keep on going, right? I think that that's actually the most likely scenario, is that what changes is minor. But, if I worked at Apple, I would be really worried about the risk that the change is going to be major and it's going to break our business. I would be.
Yeah.
But I'm trying not to be cynical here, but I suspect that the way this will work is Apple will give in on things that turns out don't actually matter as much as Apple says they do, but they want to posture that they do so that they can be pained when they do it, so that it makes, it limits the scope. And that in other cases, they basically deal with a U.S. system that is generally favoring big U.S. companies anyway, so they can get away with even less. So, I think that's the most likely scenario, in which case Tim Cook's entire approach would be more or less vindicated. But it's too early for us to say. I certainly don't. If they get really, 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 really shafted by the EU or by the United States, and it breaks their business, then it absolutely would be reasonable to say Tim Cook has to leave, right? Because they're going to need to show some resignations and say we're changing our entire approach because you're right and we're chastened and we're going to be a different company now. But boy, we're a long way from that.
I don't think we're going to get there. I don't.
I don't think so.
There is a scenario.
I think it's highly unlikely.
Yes, there is a scenario in which one of these things could be so horrifically bad that really the only smart thing to do from a PR perspective is to have a new CEO. Yes, that could happen. I do not think that's going to happen. I just don't. I don't think that compliance with the DMA or with the Department of Justice case, I don't even think it would massively impact the company. I think you would end up with a scenario where it's put to the test what we're saying has been the case forever, which is people just want to buy iPhones and use their iPhones. Yeah. And that complying with all of this stuff doesn't really make a material difference because people just want to use their iPhones.
Earlier in this podcast, we talked about how Apple, I think, overstates the value of secrecy in product announcements. I think Apple overstates the importance of lots of stuff, and they do it strategically. And this is a case where I think Apple has dramatically overstated. Not that it isn't true, but that they overstate the impact of all sorts of things, like what the EU is trying to do, the EC is trying to do, and what the US alleges. That I think they've actually, behind the scenes, they've got a lot of stuff that they're willing to give on, and they know it's not going to make an impact, or it's going to make a minor impact. They're, losing a little control, losing a little power is not necessarily something that ever shows up on a balance sheet. Losing a little money does, and it's going to hurt because Apple is a public company, and they might make a little less money, and that there are people at Apple who have a very strong incentive to prevent that from happening. But I, as an outside observer, can say even that doesn't really matter. If the spigot's still on, it's just flowing a little bit less, and it means you are a little less enormously profitable and a little less enormously valuable. I have a hard time envisioning scenarios. Doesn't mean they can't happen, but the best case scenario, or the most likely scenario, is that Apple gives up a little power, gives up a little control, but not as much as you think, and gives up a little bit of revenue in competing with others and it doesn't really matter, and that they just continue steaming forward because they're so huge and so profitable that in the end it doesn't matter. And if I had to predict, that's my prediction, is that this is not going to be the thing that stops Apple. Now, something else might stop Apple. Like the lesson of the Microsoft case is that it turns out that it was all kind of a waste of time in some ways, because the next generation of stuff kind of rendered it irrelevant. And we can argue that point. Were they distracted? Is that why they missed on mobile? The opening up the web allowed cross-platform to be better, and it wouldn't have happened if IE was unconstrained. Okay, we can argue it, but like, my bigger point remains, which is what Apple's afraid of, and Google and every other tech giant, is missing the boat on the next big thing. That's the existential risk for Apple, I think, is not being regulated. I think they're going to still have lots of money, right? I think like I said, if AI, it turns out, makes devices essentially irrelevant, and apps and operating systems irrelevant, because everything's going to be running on machine learning, and we're just going to talk or tap or whatever to a model that's going to do what we want, that could potentially eliminate a huge amount of Apple's uniqueness in the market, and therefore destroy their business model. That's a real existential threat. But I think it's unlikely that regulatory scrutiny is going to blow up Apple's business. It could happen, but I don't think it will.
But we'll be tracking it the whole way through.
Sure,
in
of course
Lawyer
we will.
Up.
Sure, exactly. Send us your anonymous secret. Nope, don't.
Well,
you can if you like, but we're not going to induce
you to do
it.
Just be careful how you do it.
And be careful. Don't use a company-managed device, whatever you do.